The moment consciousness flooded back into her body, Sophie knew something extraordinary had happened. Her eyes flew open, taking in the familiar lavender walls of her childhood bedroom, the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to her ceiling in the constellation patterns her father had helped her arrange when she was 12. Her trembling hands reached for her phone on the nightstand, May 15, 2019. The date hit her like a physical blow, sending her heart racing and her mind spinning through a kaleidoscope of memories that hadn't and #039 happened yet. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks before the college entrance exams. 2 weeks before Nathan, her first love and longest-standing friend, would betray her in a way that would shape the next 3 years of her life. 2 weeks before he would publicly accuse her of stealing Olivia and #039's expensive laptop, knowing full well she was innocent, all to pave the way for his relationship with Olivia to begin and quote, cleanly and honestly, end quote. Sophie sat up slowly, her body feeling simultaneously familiar and foreign. In her previous life, she had spent this morning frantically texting Nathan about their study plans, desperately trying to maintain their connection even as she sensed him pulling away. The memory of her own desperation made her stomach churn. End quote, Sophie. Breakfast is ready, end quote, her mother and #039's voice floated up from downstairs, exactly as it had before. The normalcy of it almost broke her. End quote, coming, Mom, end quote, she called back, amazed at how steady her voice sounded despite the storm raging inside her. As she stood before her mirror, she studied her reflection, younger, softer, unmarked by the 3 years of heartbreak and self-doubt that had defined her previous university experience. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh toast, just as she remembered. Her mother stood at the counter, preparing lunches with the same methodical care she always had. The sight brought unexpected tears to Sophie and #039's eyes. End quote, sweetheart, end quote, her mother turned, concern crossing her face. End quote, are you all right, end quote. Sophie crossed the kitchen and hugged her mother tightly. In her previous life, she had spent these last 2 weeks of high school so absorbed in Nathan and #039's growing distance that she had barely spoken to her family. End quote, I and #039 am fine, Mom. Just realized some important things, end quote. Over breakfast, Sophie began mentally mapping out her new path. In her previous life, she had followed Nathan to University B, watching from a distance as his relationship with Olivia blossomed. She had graduated with mediocre grades, no real friendships, and a spirit so broken it had taken years to repair. The memories felt like watching a stranger and #039's life now, a cautionary tale rather than her own history. That morning, instead of checking her phone for messages from Nathan, Sophie pulled out her laptop and began researching University A and #039's environmental law program, her secret dream that she and #039d abandoned in her previous life to follow Nathan. The program was everything she remembered and more: distinguished professors, innovative research opportunities, and a track record of graduates making real change in the world. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications, but Sophie ignored them, focusing instead on drafting a new study schedule. When she finally checked her messages during lunch break, she saw 5 texts from Nathan. End quote, hey, study group at my place today, end quote. End quote, Sophie, end quote. End quote, Olivia and #039's joining us for study group, end quote. End quote, are you getting these, end quote. End quote, everything okay, end quote. In her previous life, these messages had sent her into a panic, desperately trying to maintain her place in Nathan and #039's life. Now, she typed a simple response, end quote, can and #039t make it. Focusing on solo study until exams. Good luck, end quote. The next 2 weeks transformed Sophie in ways that amazed even her. She converted her bedroom wall into a study command center, with detailed notes, mind maps, and practice exam schedules. Her mother watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and curiosity, occasionally commenting on her daughter and hashtag 039's newfound focus. End quote. You seem different lately, end quote, her mother observed one evening, bringing Sophie a cup of tea. End quote. More certain of yourself, end quote. Sophie looked up from her textbooks, smiling. End quote. Let and hashtag 039's just say I had a wake-up call about what I really want from life, end quote. The day of reckoning arrived exactly as it had before. Sophie was in the library, surrounded by her study materials, when Nathan and Olivia approached her table. The sight of them together still triggered a deep ache, but this time it was more like pressing on an old bruise than receiving a fresh wound. End quote. Sophie, we need to talk, end quote, Nathan began, his handsome face set in that self-righteous expression she now recognized all too well. In her previous life, she had found him impossibly attractive even in this moment. Now, she noticed the slight cruel twist to his mouth, the calculated way he positioned himself slightly in front of Olivia. End quote. Olivia and hashtag 039's laptop is missing, end quote, he continued, end quote, and someone saw you near her locker yesterday, end quote. Sophie maintained eye contact as she calmly packed her books, a stark contrast to her previous life and hashtag 039's panic denial. End quote. Interesting accusation, Nathan. Have you checked the AV club room? Olivia often leaves her things there during practice, end quote. She stood up, addressing Olivia directly. End quote. You might want to be more careful with your belongings, and perhaps choose better company, end quote. The look of shock on their faces was deeply satisfying. In her previous life, she had been too devastated to think clearly, but she had later overheard Olivia mentioning where she had actually left her laptop. Walking away from them felt like breaking free from invisible chains. The next 2 weeks passed in a focused blur. When the exam results came out, Sophie and hashtag 039's name was near the top of the list. The acceptance letter from University A arrived shortly after, accompanied by a partial scholarship offer that had never materialized in her previous life. Moving into her dorm at University A felt like stepping into a dream she had long abandoned. The campus was everything she had imagined, historic buildings covered in ivy, modern research facilities, and a library that seemed to touch the clouds. Her roommate, Alexandra, was a vibrant art major with a quick wit and genuine warmth that Sophie had never experienced in her relationships at University B. End quote. You and hashtag 039, different from most freshmen, end quote, Alexandra commented one evening as they shared takeout in their dorm room. End quote. Most people are either terrified or overconfident, but you and hashtag 039, just sure of yourself, end quote. Sophie smiled, thinking of how much she had changed. End quote. Let and hashtag 039's just say I learned some hard lessons about not letting others define your worth, end quote. The first year at University A opened Sophie and hashtag 039's eyes to everything she had missed while obsessing over Nathan. She joined the Environmental Law Society, discovered a passion for debate, and even started rock climbing at the university gym. Her grades were consistently excellent, and professors began to take notice of her insightful contributions in class. It was during a late-night study session in the library that she met Thomas. He was a philosophy major with kind eyes and a quiet confidence that bore no resemblance to Nathan and hashtag 039's showy charm. Their first conversation about environmental ethics turned into a 3-hour discussion that left Sophie feeling intellectually energized rather than emotionally drained. End quote. You know, end quote, Thomas said as they walked back to their dorms, end quote, most people just quote the textbook when discussing deep ecology. You talk about it like you and hashtag 039 lived through environmental disasters and come back to prevent them, end quote. Sophie laughed, though something caught in her throat. End quote. Maybe in another life, end quote. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than desperate attachment. Sophie found herself learning what healthy romance looked like: no games, no manipulation, just honest communication and genuine care. The confrontation she had been half expecting finally came during her sophomore year. She was presenting at an inter-university environmental law conference when she spotted Nathan in the audience. He had changed, looked older, less confident. Olivia wasn't and #039T by his side anymore. End quote, Sophie, end quote, he called out as she was leaving the conference hall. End quote, you look different, end quote. She turned, feeling nothing but mild curiosity where once there had been desperate longing. End quote, people change, Nathan. Some of us for the better, end quote. End quote, I heard you and #039, redoing really well at University A, top of your class, end quote, there was something in his voice, regret, perhaps? End quote, listen, about what happened back then, end quote. End quote, save it, end quote, Sophie interrupted gently. End quote, that girl you knew who would have desperately wanted your apology? She doesn't and #039T exist anymore. I hope you and #039 redoing well, Nathan, but my life is on a different path now, end quote. Walking away from that conversation, Sophie felt the last weights of her past life finally lift from her shoulders. She had done it, not just changed universities, but changed her entire destiny. Her phone buzzed with a message from Alexandra about their upcoming environmental law project, followed by a sweet text from Thomas asking about their weekend plans. The next 2 years at University A flew by in a whirlwind of achievements. Sophie and #039's thesis on environmental justice caught the attention of several prestigious law firms, and she found herself fielding job offers months before graduation. Her relationship with Thomas had evolved into a deep friendship, teaching her that not all relationships needed to be romantic to be meaningful. She developed a reputation as someone who could be counted on, not just for academic excellence, but for genuine support and insight. When a junior student faced a similar situation to her past life, Sophie was able to counsel her without revealing the source of her wisdom, end quote, your worth ISN and #039T determined by those who fail to see it, end quote. On graduation day, standing in her cap and gown, Sophie couldn't and #039T help but reflect on both lives she had lived. In her previous life, she had graduated feeling defeated, still harboring desperate hopes about Nathan. Now, she stood tall, surrounded by true friends, with a bright future ahead of her. End quote, ready to change the world, end quote, Alexandra asked, linking arms with her as they prepared to receive their diplomas. Sophie smiled, thinking of that scared girl who had woken up in her bedroom 4 years ago. End quote, I already have, end quote, she replied. End quote, at least my own world, end quote. After the ceremony, Sophie found a quiet moment to herself in the university gardens. She took out her journal, the same one she had started writing in on the day of her rebirth. The pages were filled with goals, dreams, and plans, most of them now achieved or in progress. On the last page, she wrote, end quote, to the girl who thought her life was over because of someone else and #039's lies, look how far we and #039VE come. We didn't and #039T just change universities, we changed our story. We stopped letting others write our chapters and took control of our own narrative. The best revenge wasn't and #039T confronting Nathan or exposing Olivia, it was living well and truly finding ourselves. End quote, today, I graduate not just with honors, but with something more valuable, self-respect, true friendships, and a future I chose for myself. The old Sophie died from a broken heart, but this Sophie was reborn with an indomitable spirit. End quote, to anyone who might read this someday, your worth ISN and #039T determined by those who fail to see it. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead us to the best beginnings. And sometimes, being reborn ISN and #039T about getting a second chance at the same life, it and #039S about getting the courage to choose a completely different one, end quote. As she closed her journal, a gentle breeze rustled through the gardens, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. Sophie looked up at the towering spires of University A, her university, her choice, her triumph. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, a fitting backdrop to the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had been reborn, yes, but more importantly, she had been reformed, into someone stronger, wiser, and unafraid to claim the life she truly deserved. As she walked back to join her friends for the graduation celebration, her steps were light and purposeful. In her previous life, she had spent years chasing someone who had never valued her. In this life, she had finally learned to chase her own dreams instead. And that, more than any revenge or vindication, was the sweetest victory of all. We stopped letting others write our chapters and took control of our own narrative. The best revenge wasn't #039, confronting Nathan or exposing Olivia, it was living well and truly finding ourselves. End quote. Today, I graduate not just with honors, but with something more valuable, self-respect, true friendships, and a future I chose for myself. The old Sophie died from a broken heart, but this Sophie was reborn with an indomitable spirit. End quote. To anyone who might read this someday, your worth ISN and #039, determined by those who fail to see it. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead us to the best beginnings. And sometimes, being reborn ISN and #039, about getting a second chance at the same life, it and #039, about getting the courage to choose a completely different one, end quote. As she closed her journal, a gentle breeze rustled through the gardens, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. Sophie looked up at the towering spires of University A, her university, her choice, her triumph. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, a fitting backdrop to the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had been reborn, yes, but more importantly, she had been reformed, into someone stronger, wiser, and unafraid to claim the life she truly deserved. As she walked back to join her friends for the graduation celebration, her steps were light and purposeful. In her previous life, she had spent years chasing someone who had never valued her. In this life, she had finally learned to chase her own dreams instead. And that, more than any revenge or vindication, was the sweetest victory of all.